Welcome viewers to the Live Long podcast. I'm joined with Ron White today. Ron White is a former U.S. champion mnemonist. Is that how I say it? Mnemonist?
You'd probably say mnemonist.
Mnemonist, okay. So he's a U.S. champion mnemonist. He's been on tons of media coverage for his talents. He has a wonderful YouTube channel, which I'm barely getting into now, and I'm so excited to get through it, called Ron White Memory. Is it called? It has a long name. Ron White.
Well, the name of my memory course is Black Belt Memory. You might be referring to a website, Ron White Training.
Oh, I'm referring to your YouTube channel.
Oh, yeah, it does have a long name, and that's just for SEO. But if somebody typed in Ron White Memory, they'd find it.
Exactly. And you also do coaching and consulting as well, which they can find on the website, right?
Yeah, I'm Googleable.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm really glad to have you here, Ron. I really appreciate you coming by. Just to introduce you to my channel is basically about two subjects: the pursuit of longevity and health, as well as cognitive enhancement. So mainly what we deal with in cognitive enhancement is usually pharmacological means to slow the age-related decline in cognition. So trying to avoid neurodegenerative disease like Alzheimer's, dementia, and Parkinson's disease, and so on. But many of my subscribers, my channel is new, it's only 5 or 6 months old. Many of my subscribers are into like training their brains. Like particularly, I'm sure you're aware of the dual end back training, which is very popular nowadays, but people are generally interested in it. And since I was very young in the early 90s, I came across some book on mnemonics. I don't remember what it was, but eventually I did read Moonwalking with Einstein. I always found the subject interesting. So I thought it would be really cool if we could have a short chat with you and learn about what it is like being a mnemonist and how, but let's start at the beginning. So I've heard that you're from Texas.
That's right. I live in Fort Worth.
Oh, wonderful. So I was going to ask you, how did you, when you grew up, at what stage did you realize you were interested in memory? Was it something in high school or was it afterwards?
Well, you started off by saying when you were very young in the 90s. I was very young in the 70s. But I would say, starting off with my life, I got good grades in junior high and high school. I did well, but there was nobody ever said, man, you got a great memory. There was nothing special about my memory. It wasn't until 1991, the decade that you were young in, when I was 18 in 1991, that I took a memory course. And in taking that memory course, I realized I don't have a special ability, but I can learn this system, and anybody can do the system. So that's really all I've done. I've implemented a system that has given me some great results, but it's due to no natural mental ability. I don't think.
I've heard your interview with the German neuroscientist, memory champion, also where you were both discussing that, and he was agreeing with you also. What I'm curious about, you saying that you started in adulthood, basically, when you were in your 20s. So do you notice when you observe the memory champions around the world that the more, the younger they start, the better able they are to achieve world-class level performance?
Well, maybe there is some truth to that in a sense. What I will tell you that what I have noticed is that most of the memory champions are in their 20s to early 30s. There's really none that perform at a high level over the age of 37, 38 or into. There's no memory champions in their 40s. I won my championships in 2009 and 10. So, I was in my late 30s, which was older. However, the standards to become a champion were less than, because everybody as a group continued to get better. But I would say this, like baseball, Major League Baseball athletes, they say they tend to peak around age 27 or 28. I'd say I've noticed that in memory champions too.
I was going to ask about that actually, because I was curious if there was anyone over the age of 40, because that's when some elements of cognitive decline you start. Like people who eventually get Alzheimer's usually have plaques by the age of 40 or so that they don't know about. But yeah, so that's quite interesting. Also in mathematics, for example, the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in mathematics is called the Fields Medal. Those people they rarely get a Fields Medal above the age of 30, almost never. It's really interesting. So I wanted to ask, so you took this course, and maybe you can break it down for us now, actually. Are there more than one broad category of tools used to memorize things? Like, I know you're very fond of pictures and making pictures in your brain for numbers and dates and names and all kinds of things. Are there certain like categories of strategies that people use? Or is it just all pictures?
Well, there are different strategies that people use for memory. Some, will, implement spaced repetition, which, is part of what I do as well, where you review it today, you review it the next day, and then maybe in 3 days, you review the things that you don't know as well. And the things that you know better, maybe you don't review them for a little bit longer. So that's not necessarily using pictures. It's the technique of spaced repetition. With that said, when I remember when I was competing in a memory championship probably 10 years ago, they pulled 3 of us out, the top 3, and a news reporter was interviewing us, and I was at the end of the line. So they interviewed I was at the front of the line. So they interviewed me and they said, "How did you do it?" I said, "Well, I use pictures to represent numbers or whatever, and then I place it on pieces of furniture in my house. It's called a mind palace." And the reporter said, "That's fascinating." And I thought, well, thank you. I appreciate that. Then they went to the next one and they said, "So tell me, how do you do it?" And the next person said, "Well, I turn everything I want to remember into a picture, and then I place those pictures on pieces of furniture in my house." And the reporter was like, "That's amazing." And then they went to the next one. "How do you do it?" He was like, "Well, I turn," it said the same thing. So I'll say this: at a memory tournament on the high level, the world championships, the USA championships, whatever, I've rarely met anybody who's not using the technique of seeing images and storing them in what we call a mind palace, which is mental locations in a room.
And does that involve so it involves, I remember reading that in Moonwalking with Einstein that there was this memory palace that everyone was using. Does this involve, other than the pictures, does it involve a story? Is a story easier to remember than, like, if you can combine, is that why you have to walk through the palace? Because you remember like how things are juxtaposed to each other and that has an anecdotal element to it? Or why, I mean, I'm curious why it has to be in a palace. And
Well,
also,
go ahead. Say that again.
I'm curious why it has to be in a one like area, and the second thing is why whether stories are useful, because I know from psychology that anecdotes are easier to remember than facts.
Yes. So it is because if you think about it, you've gone to your friend's house before. It's cold outside. You were wearing a jacket. You told your friend, "Hey," you walk in his house and you say, "Hey, where can I put my jacket?" And your friend says, "Put it over there in that room. Put it in a chair in that room over there." So you do that. And then you hang out at your friend's house for 3 or 4 hours. When it's time to leave, your mind knows, "Hey, my jacket is in that room, in that chair. I'm going to go get it." Why? Because in your brain, mentally, you stored it there. If we store something in a location in real life, if we're paying attention when we do it and we're alert when we're doing it, we're going to remember we put it there. So it's this. Why does that work in real life? Well, I'm not exactly sure, but it does. So why does it? So it also works when it's imagined. You're placing something in a room, and this is a technique that's been around 2,500 years of seeing locations in rooms and using them to memorize data. But I guess it works just because our mind thinks in pictures. Now, to answer the next question was, what about stories? You could memorize an entire list of words or anything just by telling yourself a story, by linking one thought to the next. For example, you want to tell a story, you want to remember 3 words: phone, drink, microphone. Well, you could tell yourself a story. "I threw my phone at the drink and the drink fell over and it went onto the microphone." Well, you've linked one together, and you could link 20 or 30 items and remember it. And that method is known as clearly the story method or the linking method. The challenge with that method by itself is if I said, "What was the 7th word on that list?" You'd have to think, okay, the phone goes into the drink goes in and you'd have to count up. But if you use the mind palace method, and let's say you had 7 pieces of furniture numbered in this room, 1 was the TV, 2 was the bookshelf, 3 was the counter, and then 7 was over here, the window, you imagine something flying through the window. And then I said, well, what's number 7? You would just have to look over at the window. The mind palace kind of segments it by number. Now, last thing I'll say on this, because I definitely don't want to go on a monologue here, but the last thing that I'll say on this is that let's say you want to memorize something like I just memorized the United States Constitution. So it's 4,543 words. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice. And it goes on for 4,520 more words. To do that, I combined the story method with the mind palace method. Here's what I mean by this. So in my condo right here, if I numbered locations, number 1 would be the TV, number 2 would be the bookshelf, number 3 would be the counter. Let's just stop there with 3. Now let's say I wanted to remember 3 words. Well, the first word I want to remember is a phone. So I would imagine my phone crashing through the TV. The second word I want to remember is a drink. So I would imagine a drink on the bookshelf. In other words, it's interacting with those locations. So you get the idea. You could memorize 30 words going around my condo if I had 30 pieces of furniture. That's the mind palace method. But if we combine that with the story method that you were talking about and the story with my Coke can, remember my story with the Coke can was the phone goes into the drink and the drink goes on the microphone. Well, boom, now we've got a story there of just 3 words. So let's take that entire story and imagine it on the TV. So no longer is it just 1 word on the TV, but now you got 3 because they're linked together with a story, which is how I memorized the Constitution. I would take 7 or 8 words, create a story to remember those, and attach them to 1 location. So to sum this up, you can use the mind palace technique to memorize something. You could use the story method by itself. You combine the 2, and it becomes really powerful.
Can I ask you a question? So for example, when you memorize the Constitution, as you practice it more and more, do you get to a point where it's memorized sort of, as they would say, by rote, where you don't have to go into the palace anymore, you just hear the words and they flow?
Yeah, and that is especially true if it's something like, a shorter list, like a poem, a 20-line poem. I memorized a 20-line poem 20 years ago, and I don't even have to think about my mind palace anymore because I've said it so much. The Constitution being 4,543 words, I am not to that point yet. I think because of the quantity of the information, but you're absolutely right. That does occur after reviews, and people say, how many reviews? Well, I don't know. It's different every time for every person, but yes.
What about if something's sung a little bit as opposed to a normal text, like it's a poem, like a song? Like the reason I ask this is I'm half Arab and half actually my mother's side from Texas. But my Arab side, when I lived in the Middle East, I noticed a lot of Arabs would memorize the whole holy book of Islam, which is the Quran, and that's a 600 something pages. But they don't say it in a normal tone. They sort of sing it in a melodious, you know what I mean? I don't know if you ever heard how they say it. So I think that aids their memorization a little bit. It would be harder to memorize the Bible if you weren't singing it, I would think. But you also have a video on memorizing biblical verses.
Well, I do, but I think you're right about that. I think you're right about the melody and the singing definitely reinforces the memory. There's just something about, matter of fact, when we end this, our interview here, I have my guitar teacher coming over and he's gonna teach me guitar. And he and I actually did a song on memorizing countries and capitals using a song. So there is validity to that a rhythm and music our brains will latch onto that and remember it. There's just something to it. It's a little bit emotional for us. It sounds nice. There's a rhythm. All of that helps your memory.
Okay, I have a couple of questions about what you were saying earlier. So one thing I wanted to know about is the U.S. championships compared to the World Championships. How well do Americans fare when they go to the Worlds? Who are the dominant countries usually, just to give us an idea?
Yeah, so it's changed over the years. When I competed in 2009 and 10, and then 11 and 12 as well, the U.S., I went to the World Championships and I was number 1 in the United States, and I went to the Worlds and I finished somewhere in the middle in the world. It's not bad. It's the world, but it was in the middle. Since then, the United States has actually done very well. You know, people would always ask me, why does the United States end up in the middle of the pack instead of the top of the pack? And my response was, well, it was a sport that maybe started a little bit later, you know, a little bit later in the United States as far as a competition. And also, my really response at the time was the right people haven't heard about it yet. That's, you know, people would be like, why is the United States not winning the world championships? You know, not because of any superiority of the United States, but why has it gone 20 years and there hasn't been one? My response was the right people haven't heard about it yet. And sure enough, Alex Mullen, United States, he won the world championship several times in a row. So I'd say in the last 5 years, the United States has won it twice. China is a popular one right now. They're really excelling very well. Historically, Great Britain and Germany have done really well, but that's also where it started. So they were the first ones, you know, the tournament pops up and it's down the street from you and people aren't flying across the world to compete in it yet. So it only makes sense that people from London are going to win it. But, you know, I don't see any differences as far as any country's brains having better brains. It's just, you know, what person and what country has heard about it? Is it the right person? But right now, China's doing really well.
Well, there are. I mean, this is obviously not. Well, I heard I advise the viewers to listen to your discussion with the German memory champion, also where you guys discuss IQ and stuff. They say that anyone can really take their memory beyond a top IQ's natural memory with training. But there's definitely an IQ disparity around the world where East Asians have above average IQs, over 100 on average in Singapore, Hong Kong, and so on. I recently did a video on that. I want to ask you another thing, which is that when you got into the memory practice, did you ever have this concern that what I'm doing in terms of the memory palaces is not transferable? Meaning that, I'm sure you've heard this term before, meaning that the training I'm doing is isolated to, like I'll be able to memorize things and put them in a palace, but I may not have a better short-term memory because of it, or I may not have better attention because of it. And it may be an isolated skill that I'm developing in a similar way that chess, for example, players develop a skill with the board, where that skill doesn't seem to transfer in other parts of their life. Did you have that concern? And then what made you love it so much that you continued pursuing it to a world-class level?
Yeah, I think that's extremely true because, uh, you know, but then the question becomes, well, then why is it valuable? Well, because it's valuable. This system is valuable to me. Because even though I don't think it makes me more alert or awake or overall, because when the time comes when I say, hey, I want to memorize that poem, or hey, I want to memorize the Constitution, or hey, I want to take a new job and I want to learn all the products in this job, then I can say, okay, well, let's use the same system you use to memorize a deck of cards and memorize it fast. But it's conscious. It's a conscious decision. So I can apply it to anything, and that's why it is valuable. But I'm using the same techniques. But it's not, it doesn't, I don't feel like it enhances your overall mental alertness in any difference than reading a lot would, just because you're, you know, engaging your brain. But I do think that's true, you know, and the things that I don't like, my assistant, Amy, who you interact with all the time, she texts me every morning, Ron, these are your appointments for the day. Ron, you got an appointment coming up in 30 minutes. Ron, you got an appointment coming up in 10 minutes. And people are like, why does she have to text you so many times about your appointments? It's because, like, I don't care. I don't want to be thinking about that. I just want to be focused on what I'm doing. And then she texts me. But so I guess that's illustrates the point of what you're saying here.
Yeah, that's, I mean, that's a good way to live also, because you need to be immersed in what you're doing. Otherwise, you're not really there. That brings us to another issue, which is I studied cognitive psychology a bit in undergrad at Carnegie Mellon, where Herbert Simon started cognitive psychology. And I learned about this concept of chunking, which I'm sure you've heard about before. And also this idea, my overall impression about memory was that the more you engage with a subject matter and the more levels with which you analyze something, the more it gets ingrained in your long-term memory. Meaning that, for example, when I've been doing this for 10 years, when I read books, I annotate I annotate on the margins, and I underline and I circle. I have very complex systems of. Sometimes I write stuff that's really useless. Like sometimes I write haha if something made me laugh,
Yeah.
but it makes me remember the book much better. And then do you find that as well? I know obviously that's not what you're competing at, but do you notice that as well with your clients and generally?
Oh yeah, there's a book. It was written in the 1700s by a guy named Isaac Watts. It's called "The Improvement of the Mind." And it's since it was written 200 years ago, you can go to Google Books and get it for free. But "The Improvement of the Mind" by Isaac Watts, and in that book, he talks about one of the things. The title of the chapter is "How to Read a Book." And one of the things he says about it and how to read a book is he's like, read with a pen. He's like, underline the main things, make annotations in the side marks of the side. But then he says, also close the book and just dwell on it. Think about it. He says, maybe even if he said, write down what you found useful in the book, what you thought the author did well, what you thought. And he's like telling you all these different things. And after you go through it, it's like, man, you're putting a lot of work into this book. And he makes the comment, reading one book this way is more valuable than reading 20 books just skimming through them. So yeah, I totally agree with that. And the more you can just dive, I just like people are like, I read 100 books a year. Yeah, well, why not read 10 books a year that you really just dive into?
I had an argument with a fellow, a friendly argument a few months ago with a fellow who was very into speed reading.
Yeah.
And of course, anyone like maybe me or yourself who are interested in, doing something interesting with their brains comes across speed reading when they're young, tries it out and realizes its limitations and uses, right? So
Yeah.
you can skim through a book and learn its format. You can learn its subject matter. I can do that. Once you read enough, you can do that even without the training of those books, which I read also. But you are not engaging that much. You're doing the opposite of what we're talking about right now. So, in a few months, you won't remember much of it and you won't have gotten that value out of it, I think. Don't you agree?
I totally agree. And people are going to think it's crazy because I sell a speed reading course, but let me say this, so if I sell a speed reading course, how could I be in agreement with what you're saying? Well, this is the way I see speed reading as useful. It's when you pick up a book and you're like, do I want to devote my time to reading this book or not? Okay, why don't we speed read it real quick and just skim through it and go through it really quick and see if it's valuable. And then after we speed read it, then we're like, whoa, I think this is really good. Well, then let's go back and dive into it and read it slow and underline and all that. Instead of let's speed read this book and put it away and speed read the next book and put it away. I don't think that's the way to go.
That is really useful for figuring out if you want to read a book. I've been doing that myself just naturally. And also sometimes it's useful if you I used to work in investment banking, private equity. Sometimes it's useful to go through some like reports that you need to know what the report's about, but you don't really need to engage that, or especially if it's bad writing, like you don't really need to, it's not that deep, but you need to know what the report is about. It's very useful. For people who don't know how to do that at all, it's really useful because usually people don't know how to do that at all, haven't read many books before. So they just start at the top and they read word by word and so on. I have a few more questions about what you were saying earlier. One thing I wanted to ask you about, which is to me a very interesting subject, most of the things I'm interested in are pharmacology and nutrition and supplementation, how it affects the brain. So you have a lot of clients, and I'm sure you yourself have been interested in this subject. Do you do anything special in terms of supplementing to affect your brain's function, or eating in a certain way, like ketogenic, for example?
Say that last word again.
I was saying, like, for example, ketogenic diets, because ketogenic diets seem to overall improve the cognitive function in people across age groups.
Yeah. So as far that intermittent fasting plays a role in the ketosis or the ketogenic diet. And I'm not a nutritionist, but I'm right in saying that, correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, I don't eat until 11 a.m. And I try not to eat after 7 p.m. But I find myself getting oatmeal cookies or whatever. Sometimes last night it was yogurt. So I'm not a Olympic level athlete at that. But with that said, I am very conscious about everything I eat. And really the main reason that I am is partly for physical health, but it's mental health. One thing that I really struggle with, and people find this hard to believe, but I'd say it's the biggest struggle of my life, is brain fog. And the reason it's the biggest struggle of my life, because my job is so much engaged in the brain. Even if I'm not doing a memory demonstration where I'm memorizing a bunch of stuff, I am, optimizing my website or writing blogs, and it's all on the brain. And if you got brain fog, it's difficult. So I do, but I do really simple things, like I try to drink enough water, I exercise. As far as supplements I'll take, I kind of keep that simple. I don't have any branded ones that I use. I just take the regular omega-3s. I have been interested lately in this supplement that Joe Rogan talks about, the Alpha Brain.
Oh, I could give you better tips than that one. That's not,
okay.
It's not a good formulation even. I tell you, I sent you an email with just like 3 things to try out, totally healthy.
Okay.
Basically, the quickest way you can affect cognition, not brain fog. Brain fog is something I also deal with, and I've researched tremendously. And I know how to cure it, but sometimes I don't want to do the things necessary. But brain fog can come from a couple of things. One could be, and this is unlikely in our case, but for young people, it could be neurotrophic factors in the brain. Growth factors will cause brain fog. But generally, what will happen at our age is inflammation, neuroinflammation from the microglia in the brain. And this inflammation can come from so many sources, including stress, including overactive adrenergic system, being on the go all the time, but including dietary inflammation from the diet, like from carbohydrates or from, for example, saturated fats, which are actually neurotoxins. So they activate the microglia in the brain, which release inflammatory cytokines, which then cause this brain fog. It's reliable. Like if I go and eat Chinese food, for example, with MSG and all that, I'll have brain fog right afterwards. And then if my diet has more carbohydrates in it, especially simple carbohydrates, I'll have brain fog. But I can't really cure that with the supplements, but you can really improve brain function with supplements. Actually, let me tell you one thing. One supplement that will improve it is, you're talking about omega-3s, the EPA, but not the DHA. If you take a lot of the EPA, like 4 grams a day, you might notice a difference. That and NAC will lower the inflammation systemically. But we could talk about this another time, but it's a really fun subject for me.
No, we will. I might interview you for my channel with this, because I was like, oh my gosh, I need to interview him now.
That's what I spend. No, that's very kind of. That's what I spend all my time with the pharmacology, but not with the exercising of the brain, which is why I really wanted to talk to you more about. Okay, I want to ask you a few more questions. So, in your training for the competition, I know this is a little bit detailed for the audience. Maybe they're not going to compete, but in your training for the 2009, 2010 competitions, how do you spend your time? Because what I'm realizing is you guys have to dedicate hours and hours a day training. How do you organize the training? Do you have certain tasks at the competition that you know are going to come up, and you model it around that?
Yeah, so there are, in the USA Championship, there's 7 events, and you know what they're going to be. The first one is they're going to give you a sheet of paper, and it's going to have a bunch of names and faces, and then they're going to take the paper away, and it's just going to be faces, and you got to fill in the names. The next one event is they're going to give you a sheet of numbers, and you memorize it and write them out. The next one is going to be a deck of cards. How fast can you memorize it? By the way, earlier you brought up Joshua Foer. When he competed, he set a record for the fastest to memorize a deck of cards in the United States. It's in the book Moonwalking with Einstein. I'm the guy who broke Josh's record, but we're friends. We're good. We're good buddies. We text once a year. So you know the events. You know the events that are going to happen. So then you just develop a strategy for each event. And really, when it comes down to memory and memorizing faster, we're all using the mind palace technique. So in a sense, it's who is going to be able to go through their mind palace quicker. But even more than that, one of the things that really accelerates the speed at which someone can go is how much are they compressing the data. For example, if you want to memorize 50 numbers and you have a picture for every digit 0 to 9, well, you got to memorize 50 pictures. You have a picture for every 2-digit number, 25 pictures. You have a picture for every 3-digit number, 17 pictures, 18 pictures, right? 17 pictures, 16 and a half, 17 pictures. So you are, well, that's one more, 16 and a half. So here's the point. The more you can compress the data, the faster you can go. So to answer your question, what does training look like a lot? For those who want to compete at a high level, the first step that they do is they say to themselves, okay, I want to memorize 3 cards at a time, or I want to memorize 2 cards at a time, or I want to memorize 3 digits at a time. So then they start creating images and getting real familiar with those images. And that's probably the beginning stages of anybody's training who's taking it serious. And then after that, then yes, they would just devote hours a day to going through the images and doing trial runs and practice and practice and practice.
So you have pictures for 3-digit numbers that are consistent. Those, I know with normal numbers you have certain, like the balloon is a 9 and so on. You're used to that, but you have that for 3 digits too?
Yes.
Wow, that's really impressive. That's
Yeah.
very detailed. I wouldn't even remember what I had. You know why I never did the Palace method when I read the book, The Moonwalking with Einstein, is I tried, and obviously I didn't know what I was doing, but I tried, and I was completely, this palace was foreign to me. I walked around it and I said, I don't remember anything I put here. It didn't come naturally. I don't know if it came naturally to you the first time you did it.
Well, if you didn't remember why, it's probably because the pictures, there wasn't enough emotion. They weren't vivid enough. You might have gone through it too quickly. Because
I think the associations between the pictures and the objects were not very strong. Yeah.
Correct. If you make for example, if that bookshelf behind you right now caught on fire in the middle of this interview, you'd jump up and you'd be telling that story for 3 years from now because it was so emotional and it actually happened. But if I said, hey, look at the bookshelf and say the word fire, and you did it. Well, in 10 years, I see you. I'd say, what was the word I told you to say? You'd be like, oh man, I have no idea. But if it actually caught on fire, you would remember. So that's one of the keys to the Mind Palace, the vivid pictures.
Do you train athletes that are going to compete and that want to compete in the subject in the US or in the world?
I
Or
don't.
are the people you train mostly interested in improving their cognition for themselves?
Yeah, and here's why. It's not out of selfishness, but it's just out of prioritization. The typical person who is going to compete in a memory tournament is not really willing to pay you for those services. You know what I'm saying? So it's not that I don't want to help anybody. If somebody asks me, what's your advice? I'll say, man, I got plenty of YouTubes on that or interviews, go for it. But I don't sit down and coach them. One day, maybe when money's not an object to me in my life anymore and I got nothing but free time all day long, I would actually enjoy that. I would love to give back and coach people that way.
So most of your clients, what kind of walks of life what attracts them to the subject, just out of curiosity?
Yeah, we find a lot of people who are, studying for exams, students, who want to just remember more. And then we have a lot of business people who are want to be able to give speeches without notes or remember names and faces. And then there's just the people who just like to learn. They like, man, I just love learning. I want to learn about this. I want to be able to learn faster. So those are probably the primary reasons people get involved with us.
We were talking about transferability earlier, about the expertise. So what you guys have is expertise with the Palace method, and so the transferability of chess, for example, is not really strong. I mean, you really can't use that board. I mean, for example, when they test chess champions, if the pieces are not aligned in a normal way that could come out of a normal game, they can't remember what the board looked like if they're shown it. But if it's normal, they can. So even within the chessboard, they can't remember it if it's a little bit different. But
okay.
Mnemonics, the tool you guys are using, like you said earlier, is actually useful, because I was thinking about it. I often have problems with names. I mean, what I do is I have a list on my phone, which I go through, and whenever I meet someone new, I put it on the phone. But it is a tool that you can literally use on a daily basis on things that you need to do. I mean, mostly I'm thinking about names. But also, I guess in studying.
No, and studying, if I was taking a history test and I had 100 facts that I needed to remember for this history test, and I was given a sheet of paper, I could look at those facts, store it in my mind palace, go in and take the test and get 100% on the test. I would have 100% confidence in that. So for the exams, it's easy, or it's a direct application. I gave a speech 20 years ago at a car dealership. And afterwards, the manager said, "Come into my office." His name was Dan Frog. Last name was Frog. And in his office, he had 200 or 300 statues of little bitty frogs all over his office. It's been 20 years. I still remember his name. Why? Because he turned his last name into a picture and put it all around his office. So that's a technique, actually, to see the person's name as a picture. Well, looking at you, you got a lion on your hat. What is my picture for Leo? It's a lion. So actually, you are giving me and everybody else a way to remember your name by giving them the picture for your name. So remembering names is all about seeing images for the names. And Dan Frog had frogs. You have a lion, and it works for both of you.
I've been trying to do exactly that, but unfortunately, there's a channel called Valuetainment, which is actually a great channel. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but
Patrick,
Patrick Bet David, have you seen
it? Search his channel. He's interviewed me.
Has he interviewed? Really?
Yeah, he's a friend of mine. Hang on one second.
He has a lion too. That's what I was gonna say. That's the problem. People think I stole his logo.
No, I did notice the similarities.
Yeah.
Between that. Anyways, I got his book. He just mailed me his book. He autographed it.
Oh, well, I'll go watch that interview too. I didn't even know. I haven't watched all his videos. I didn't.
Yeah, top end Patrick, Brett David, Ron White. Yeah, he's a friend of mine. He's just 60 minutes from here, or
yeah, he's close to me. Wow. Okay, so basically, I tried to tell my audience. I swear I had this logo from 2010, but no, it's my name. I can't. But it looks the same. We both like red too, so I really have to differentiate it a little bit.
That's okay. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you another subject, which is, so you got involved in. We're almost closing. I just want to ask one more question, then I want to ask your advice for the audience. But the last question I want to ask you is, actually, tomorrow or after tomorrow, I'm interviewing Arthur Benjamin. He's a mathematician, he calls himself. Have you ever heard of him before?
Yeah, we don't know. We're not friends, and he may have never heard of me, but I know who he is. Yes.
Yeah, I've read his book before when I was younger also, and I'm excited to interview him. He does something very interesting for the audience just to know. He does a lot of complex mental math, long, big numbers, division in his head, multiplication. I was curious, have you ever gotten into other so-called tricks in the brain, like math or anything else? And also how you do on the dual end back test?
You know what? I know I've heard of it. I know very limited about the dual and back, so I couldn't even answer any more on that than I just did. So I don't know.
Yeah.
But going to the other, I would say I have been very interested in speed math. Scott Flansburgh and Lucie or Vieira are both good friends of mine, legitimate good friends. We text, all the time. And they're both into that. And so I've asked them to teach me stuff. They both held Guinness records for that, for math. And I am interested in it. I've never perfected the speed math. When I set the record for the fastest to memorize a deck of cards, David Blaine, the magician, called me and he said, can I give or his assistant said, can I give David Blaine your cell phone number? And I'm like, you could give him my social security number. Yeah. But so I went to David Blaine and I taught him how to do some memory tricks, and he taught me how to do some math tricks. And I hate using the word tricks when associated with memory, because I call it a system more than a trick. With that said, he picked up on it just like that. I mean, he learned it quicker than anybody I've ever explained it to, because I wasn't just doing the mind palace. I was talking about a little bit more how to turn 3-digit numbers into pictures and stuff like that. But with that said, memory and magic, those seem to go together. Harry Lorraine was a 94-year-old memory expert now, but he was a magician. Chester Santos, who is the 2008 USA memory champion, he was a magician. There's a lot of magicians in the memory field, and vice versa. So that is one mental thing that does. And I'm trying to think about why. Well, sometimes memorizing a list of 20 words can kind of seem like magic to somebody. So it's probably the same thing that draws them in. And I have a little bit of interest in magic, but nothing to a level where I would want to demonstrate anything.
So a final piece of advice for our audience, other than, I'm sure I'm going to be spending a lot of time on your channel. I only found it a couple of weeks ago, so I'm going to spend a lot of time there. But other than your channel and some of your publications, which are on Amazon, by the way, for the audience, there's a couple of, I don't know if they're just ebooks or printed books also.
I have both. If I would start at the YouTube channel though. I think that's a really great place. RonWhiteVideo.com redirects to my YouTube.
Okay, great. But I wanted to ask you, in terms of the books, since I'm a fan of books, and I've read Moonwalking with Einstein, which, yeah, for the audience to know, is just sort of like a book to interest you in the subject. It's not like something to learn from really that much. But do you have any favorite books in your field that you've come across, or
Well, the grandfather of memory training for the current age. Memory training goes back 2,500 years. And I collect old memory books. I've got bookshelves over there of memory books that are 200 or 300 years old. Isaac Watts' Improvement of the Mind. It's not specifically memory, but it's the mind. So that's why I bought it. I actually have a 250-year-old copy over here. I would tell everybody to go download that book, get the free PDF. It's just fascinating. As far as the memory books though go, Harry Lorraine wrote a book in the 70s, and this is hard to remember. It's called The Memory Book. But he co-authored that with a basketball player, Jerry Lucas, and he of the modern age, he is the leading marketer. There are people who have memorized faster and more, but his book, he was a great marketer of his time. He was on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson 26 times.
wow. Okay, this is very helpful. That's sort of what I was trying to get at. Well, Ron, I really got to thank you for being with us today. I'm really honored to have you on the show. And I hope, I'm going to send you an email with some supplement ideas. Maybe you try them out. Let me know how you experience it. It's not going to alleviate the brain fog directly. That's a little bit more complicated, but I bet you'll experience a non-stimulant improvement in concentration.
Yeah, please let me know about that. I would love to hear about that.
Absolutely, Ron. Thank you so much for being with us.